My dear friends at the Church of the River here in Memphis, I thought your spiritual leader and my good friend, Sam Teitel, was my friend until he asked me to preach on this first Sabbath weekend after the 2020 presidential election. I am intentionally preaching this sermon from the same prayer space at Temple Israel in the Danziger Chapel, where many of you gathered on the Sunday after the flood that dislocated the wonderful members of the Church of the River. Some of you who live close by told me that was your first time inside this prayer space. And I cannot wait until our two congregations would share a deep mission for the greater good of Memphis, from the Mississippi River border, where you are, to way out east here at Temple Israel. No matter what the physical distance, we are spiritually united as one community of faith during these perilous pandemic times. That flood, I know, seems like eons ago. And so does the onset of the out-of-control virus. When we suspended indoor services in this space on Friday, March 13th, there were 556 coronavirus cases in the United States and 7 deaths. A little over 30 weeks later, there are over 8 million cases, not 556, and more than 220,000 deaths, not 7. Epidemics seldom end with miracle cures. As I have learned from some of your own members and researchers at St. Jude, most of the time in the history of medicine, the best way to end disease was to build a better sewer system and get people to wash their hands or wear masks. Perhaps the best way to end the sickness in our society is the intercession of 1,000 smaller sanities, like our common humanity, in our different paths to the one God who loves us all. It's like the large poster I once saw outside a Unitarian Universalist church that could also be displayed outside this synagogue. The poster reads, "Be the church," in our case, be the synagogue. Then it lists core principles and beliefs: care for the poor, protect the environment, forgive often, reject racism, share earthly and spiritual resources, embrace diversity, fight for the powerless, love God, enjoy this life. But how to enjoy this life, given the mind-bending mainstreaming of hate platforms, which use words as weapons to incite? Lest we forget, from the book of Genesis, language was God's tool of creation. God created the world by uttering words like, "Let there be light," which the Creator called day and the evening night. We have learned from this election that words said by those in power have the power to create worlds and save lives, or when used dangerously or recklessly, words can destroy and kill thousands of people just with a word. The title for this post-election sermon was going to be Making Up is Hard to Do. But a better title is Being Considerate is Hard to Do. And it's this shared prayer space following the Church of the River flood a few years ago, and the tapestry behind me, this beautiful tapestry recalling Noah and what happened after the flood. I don't mean the rainbow as a sign of God not destroying the world again unless we humans do. That's a sermon I don't need to preach, given what humanity has been doing to destroy the planet and each other in recent times. No, that's not the part I am referring to. The sacred Torah in the Ark is clearly not a scroll about perfect people. It describes ordinary people, weak and imperfect, who made mistakes. The story of Noah is a superb illustration of this truth. Noah, we are told, was a righteous man in his generation. In fact, only because of Noah did the world earn a second chance for survival. But the Noah episode did not end with the end of the flood. In many ways, the closing incident of the Noah narrative is more important than the beginning. This is the part of the story few of us ever learned in Sunday school because it is somewhat embarrassing to tell. Here's what happened. The Torah reports that after the flood had receded and life had resumed its ordinary course, Noah became a farmer and planted a vineyard. We're further told that Noah degraded himself and consumed so much wine from his vineyard that he drank himself into a drunken stupor. While he was muttering to himself, lying naked on the floor, one of Noah's sons laughed at the sight of his drunken father, ran out to report the comical sight to his brothers. The other two brothers, however, did not think it was funny. Instead, they returned to their father's tent, looked away from the shameful scene, and covered their father's nakedness, we are told, with his garment. Consideration is what distinguished those two reactions. Consideration is what links one human heart to another. Without consideration, love itself is an empty, self-serving exercise. People who care about each other may not always agree. Indeed, they very likely will not, but never need those shortcomings exclude a measure of consideration and thoughtfulness. That's what the world and our country need now more than ever before, especially in the wake of the indecent and fear-based presidential campaign just waged. How can our nation's leaders command respect if they do not demonstrate an element of decency themselves? We cannot blame our nation's leaders alone for the absence of consideration and decency in America today. Perhaps we should rightly expect elected officials to rise above the lying and deceit condoned and even encouraged in contemporary American society. But the antics of political strategists should not serve as an excuse for our own personal behavior. That's why your church and this synagogue is so critical to the time in which we live. This synagogue and your church is not a place in which perfect people gather in self-righteous appreciation of each other. We gather, whether virtually or in person outdoors, to recognize our weaknesses and to find new strength. We know we are not perfect. We come in order to find guidance and inspiration to improve our lives, our nation, our world. And the rabbis make the point that God did not want to destroy all life on earth. Noah's generation was given every opportunity to prevent the flood, but they continued their corrupt ways. Greed, the early rabbis said, and distrust, cheating, and dishonesty ruled during Noah's time. God wanted to save them, to preserve all life, but they refused to cooperate. They could have changed the course of history, but they would not change themselves or as a society. That is why perhaps the greatest gift God has given us on this Sunday is the gift of second chances. Every day is a gift of second chances from God. Second chances to be more considerate. Second chances to be more trusting and less cynical. Second chances to repair a broken nation. Second chances to patch up meaningful relationships. To embrace those whom we really love and tell others how much we care about them. Being considerate and making up are both hard to do, my friends, but achieving both is within our power. Yes, there will always be some characters who prefer ridicule to decency. But the majority of humans know better. Ordinary people just like you who embrace tenderness, respect, and sensitivity instead of ridicule, revenge, or humiliation. We gather each Sabbath to remind ourselves that moral discernment was God's greatest gift to the first humans in Genesis and to us. Discerning right from wrong, good from evil, learning to judge all people by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin or the creed of their particular faith. Not seeing the inherent worth of individuals, or put differently, grouping people according to race, ethnicity, or faith is among the lingering curses of this election we must correct. When you read our shared scripture, you ever notice that labeling groups is valued in only one circumstance? Labeling is valued only in reference to the plight of a vulnerable group. That is why widows, orphans, and strangers are singled out to be cared for, not humiliated. Notice that the Torah never specifies whether it is a rich widow or an impoverished one, a black orphan or a Caucasian one. The bottom line, says Judaism, is that the vulnerable must be protected along with all people who find themselves forgotten by society. Labeling people according to race, class, or gender is a betrayal of good religion, because when you lump and stereotype people according to some group classification, you betray the divine sacredness of the individual, that image of God I read about. And you shatter the opportunity to see other people for the precious divine soul and unique signature of God every person is. How can you truly see another person as the face of God? How can you recognize the image of God in every person if what you see or say is race, nationality, class, or creed? When President Reagan was recovering from the John Hinckley shooting, Mother Teresa paid him a visit and told him, "Because of your suffering and pain, President Reagan, you will now understand the pain and suffering of the world. This has happened to you at this time because your country and the world need you." Stephen Carter, in his book, The Culture of Disbelief, observed, and I quote, "Imagine for a moment Reagan was so moved by Mother Teresa's words that he suddenly decided to turn his presidency into a political effort to do the will of God, as interpreted by her. He might then have declared a war on poverty, a war on disease. He probably would have been cheered across the nation by liberals and progressives. He would have been no irrational religious zealot, improperly mixing church and state, but a man devoted to a good and moral cause. Now, of course, Mother Teresa opposed poverty and abortion with equal vehemence. Suppose the inspired Reagan had chosen abortion instead of poverty as the object of his religious ire, shutting down Planned Parenthood on day one in office. If Reagan had done that, would he then have been condemned as a religious zealot by our secular culture? One shudders to think, Carter concludes, that the answer might turn on which part of Mother Teresa's work the president chose to pursue. The point Carter makes, and the point we would all do well to ponder, is that religious conviction is not the basis for legitimate opposition in matters of public debate. The battle for popular support depends on the merit of the cause, on the power of its defenders to convince a majority that the principle is a just, equal, and moral one, irrespective of religious motivations. If that be our standard, then I state unequivocally that our disagreement as progressives who promote an inclusive faith, our disagreement with the religious right is their rejection of the time-honored American principle of pluralism. Any religious faith may insist upon the absolute truth of its claims about the world inside its group. But when it comes to our living together, the most we are permitted to do is to seek to persuade each other of the wisdom of our proposals and convictions. This is a far cry from the pro-life director of Operation Rescue, who stated unequivocally, and I quote, "Our goal in the election is a Christian nation. We have a biblical duty. We are called by God to conquer this country. We don't want pluralism," end quote. Another major quarrel I have with this kind of thinking on the relationship between religion and politics is that it not only rejects pluralism, it emphasizes private morality rather than public morality. Most religiously motivated groups in America have lobbied strenuously in the past for changes on the assembly line, the treatment of farm workers, or in the military, or the inner city, or the school classroom, all of which seem the proper domain of government and the public. The religious right, however, labors to regulate matters of privacy and personal conscience, the school books you read in public schools, what you do with your body, what you do in the bedroom, who you love, who decides an individual woman's health, and who controls a woman's decision-making. I would insist as a religious person that while matters of public morality should be legislated, matters of private morality must not. As a religious Jew, I oppose any attempt to legislate private morality for all of America. In this respect, I often think about the two religious disciples of two great religious leaders in my faith who were arguing heatedly about the rightness and relative power of their respective rabbis. My rabbi once said, is so powerful that when he speaks, God listens. The other replied, my rabbi is even more powerful because when God speaks, he listens. We all have been touched with the spark of divine goodness, Unitarian Universalists, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, even agnostics and atheists. We each possess a portion of God's greatness. The truth, whatever it is, cannot be complete without all of us together. The world cannot be whole. Our nation will not be whole until we accept all its parts. That lesson is the lesson of my Jewish heritage, and I believe your Unitarian Universalist heritage. And that message, I think, is our most powerful response to those who will still insist on obedience and coercion instead of pluralism and celebrating all the threads that make up the fabric of this American tapestry, a tapestry that is richer with all colors and creeds, and a nation that is simply better together. Amen.